Alright, we'll go ahead and get started here then. So, for those of you guys that don't know me, my name is Torolf. I have been assisting Brandon with teaching back in the old Iron Hall, off and on, for the better part of the last 2 years, before the sim had closed. And now that the sim's back open again, we're going to go ahead and try and start getting out some new class material. Some of these older classes, this particular one about the Honor of Torvaldsland that I wrote with a little bit of help from Wynn and Bane and Maisie, we're going to go ahead and bring these back out because they're still relevant today. I still go to Southern Sims every now and then and get told that I'm an honorless dog and all manner of other colorful adjectives, which seems to lead some credence to the fact that the idea that Torvaldsland people are all outlaws, that we have no sense of honor or ethics, and as we will point out during the course of this class, that is completely and utterly not true. As I'm going along today, if you guys have any comments or questions at any point, I need you to type an exclamation point in the local chat, like so. That way I know to shut up at the end of whatever passage I'm reading, and I will go ahead and have you type out whatever your question is, and we'll go ahead and address that. Anything before we get started? Oh, you people are easy today. All right, then. Who is it? I've got Vita. If you would go ahead and start with the transcription, I'll go ahead and start reading. All right. So, while not the honor of the Scarlet case that we see in the South, Torvaldsland did indeed have a moral and ethical code that its people lived by. As with so many things in Marauders of Gore, you have to read the story and then pick apart the details to actually see it, since the book was never intended to be a handbook for the daily life of a Torvaldslander. Rather, its purpose was to tell a story, using Torvaldsland as a backdrop, beautifully yet hastily painted, in order to better support the story being told, giving only nuances to the way that the men and women of the far north lived. Sometimes we lose sight of this, as the story of Forkbeard, who was a rogue outcast of the north, was the main supporting character, and in his own ideals didn't always embody those of his countrymen, but even he was virtuous in his own right. So today we'll explore the tenets of the Torvaldsland Code of Conduct by displaying book quotes and explanations for those quotes. It's the intent of this class to provide examples of righteous and ethical behavior displayed by the men of Torvaldsland, straight from the book, in the hopes that people will better understand that not every Jarl was Ivar Forkbeard, and even those that were akin to him were not some primitive thug or barbarian. To quote the book, Marauders of Gore, this man, called out Sveen Bluetooth, obviously impressed, has earned in these contests 6 talents. Never in the history of the thing has there been so high a winner. Sveen Bluetooth was of Torvaldsland himself. He well understood the mightiness of the winner's exploits. It was rare for one man to win even 2 talents. Thousands entered the contests. Only one in each contest could achieve the winner's talent. I distinguish myself and enter into the history of our land, said the Bluetooth, in being the High Jarl to award these talents of the games. As we honor this man, in doing this, similarly do honor unto ourselves. This was cultural in Torvaldsland. One is regarded as being honored when one rightly bestows honor. It is not like one man taking something from another, so much as it is an exchange of gifts. To a somewhat lesser extent, it might be mentioned that this too is cultural in the South. So we can see by that passage very clearly that there's a different set of criteria for the honor of Torvaldsland. Honor was as core to the men of the North as it was to the rest of men of Gore. The first virtue we talk about is honesty in the class. And honesty and the power of the sworn oath was of dire importance to the people of Torvaldsland. Even Forkbeard himself, in his own warped way, took a man's word very seriously and felt the sting of injustice when it was lashed upon him. Of course, being an outcast himself, he was pretty stingy with whom he kept his word. However, we find very few instances of him really being untrustworthy to his fellow countrymen, at least, and was unwilling to lie to the High Jarl Bluetooth, though Bluetooth was the one to have declared him outlaw. From page 132 of Marauders of Gore, we pass some fellow whom we noted seized 2 bars of red-hot metal and ran some 20 feet with him, and then threw them from him. "What is he doing?" I asked. "He is proving that he has told the truth," said the Forkbeard. Now, this passage doesn't specify if the man grabbed the bars with bare hands or not, but even if he had gloves on, it must have been painful in the extreme. Remember, these were red-hot bars of metal. So in this passage, we see that even the common man put such value on the truth that he would go to lengths such as these to prove himself to be honest, and that such proof was then accepted by the person to which it was given. I rather admired Sveen Bluetooth. He was a man of his word. By his word he would stand, even though, as in the present case, any objective observer would have been forced to admit that his provocation to betray it, his temptation to betray it, must have been unusual in the extreme. In honor, such a high Jarl must set an example to the men of Torvaldsland. He had nobly, if not cheerfully, set that example. It's from page 166. In this passage, we see that Bluetooth, despite having in his own mind every reason to kill Ivar Forkbeard on sight, knew that to break his word before his people would then cast him down in their eyes. As a high Jarl, that's just not something his men would abide by. It was because he upheld the standards of Torvaldsland and set an example to his men that even his unjust weregild was accepted in the first place. Interestingly enough, Bluetooth's setting of the weregild was a demonstration of cleverness, which we'll get into later on in the class. Seize him and heat oil had been the first cry of the Bluetooth. Your oath, had cried the horrified, startled rune priests. Seize him, screamed the Bluetooth, but his men had forcibly restrained him, they glaring at Ivar Forkbeard with ill-disguised disapproval. This is from page 164. In this quote, we see that the initial outburst brought on by the reveal of Forkbeard at the Thing, and in the heat of the moment, Bluetooth had every intention of just killing him right then and there. It was only through his followers' determination not to let the Jarl break his oath that allowed Bluetooth a chance to even calm down. So this shows us that not only is the Jarl expected to hold the standards of his culture, but his men might physically force him to do so. I relaxed. It seemed we would come alive, after all, out of the hall of the Bluetooth. I had only feared some treachery or trickery upon his part, some northern trick. Yet he had now before his men spoken, and I knew him by this time to be one who stood with his word and stood well with it, and proudly. His word was to him as his land, as his sword, as his honor, as his ship. It would be kept. It would be neither demeaned nor broken. From page 176. As John Norman is wont to do, he tends to repeat himself often in the books. To call him pedantic would mean there's a picture of him right next to that word in the dictionary. In this paragraph, we see Tarl having already heard Bluetooth's vow to keep his oath. He has now been within the man's hall long enough to know that he would keep said oath. Of course, this was just moments before Ivar announced he wouldn't even pay the weregild. It was a shame that the Cur attack came when it did, for we'll never know if Bluetooth's reaction to Ivar snubbing him and what it would have been. Because if he had been provoked before, certainly at that point, he very well may have broken it, but who knows. Meanwhile, the debate at the back of the dais went on. The issues seemed reasonably clear, though I could catch only snatches of what had been said. They concerned the pleasures of boiling the Forkbeard and his retinue alive, as the dangerous precedent might have been set if the peace of the Thing were sundered, and the loss of credit which might accrue to Sveen Bluetooth if he reneged on his pledged oaths, deep oaths publicly and voluntarily given, is the bolded section there. There were also considerations to the effect that the rune priest would be distressed if the oaths were broken, and that the gods too might not look lightly upon the violation of faith, and might too, more seriously, evidence their displeasure with such tokens as blights, plagues, hurricanes, and famines. Again, these considerations, it was argued that not even the gods themselves could blame Sveen Bluetooth, under these circumstances, for not honoring such a piddling oath, extracted under false pretenses. One bold fellow even went so far as to insist that under these special circumstances, it was a solemn obligation incumbent on the Bluetooth to renounce his oath and commit the Forkbeard and his followers, with the exception of the slaves, of course, who would be confiscated, to the oil pots. Fortunately, in the midst of his eloquence, this fellow sneezed, which Omen at once decisively wiped away the weightiness of his point. At last, the Bluetooth turned to face the Forkbeard. Sven's face was red with rage. The high priest lifted the sacred temple ring. "The peace of the thing," said the Bluetooth, "and the peace of my house," this is again the bolded section here, "for the time of the thing is upon you. This I have sworn, this I will uphold." This is page 166. In this passage, we see that the violation of the sworn oath runs so deep that the very gods of Torvaldsland would be believed to possibly taking offense to its breaking. However, because of Ivar's own trickery, some believed the gods would forgive the breaking of the oath. Fortunately for Tarl and Ivar, the people of Torvaldsland are very deeply superstitious as well as religious, and the bad omen very possibly saved their lives. Any comments or questions about the honesty aspect of things before we move on?
We take a break here, looking for questions from the crowd. This may take a few minutes as people take an opportunity to type or pause as Toralf continues on. This passage has not ended and the class continues momentarily.
See, guess it's the easy crowd today. Alright then, moving on to hospitality and the stingy host. In Torvaldsland we have a long haul. Unlike the tavern scene in the south, we don't charge a traveler who visits our homes in the villages for room and board, but instead we share our food and drink with them. In the harsh environment we exist in, to do anything else would be considered cruel and barbaric. From page 145 of Marauders of War, I had not intended to participate in the competition. Rather, it had been my plan to buy some small gift for the Forkbeard. Long had I enjoyed his hospitality, and he had given me many things. I did not wish, incidentally, even if I could, to give him a commensurate gift with what he had in his hospitality bestowed upon me. The host in Torvaldsland should make the greatest gift. It is, after all, his house, or his hall. In his guest should be made a greater, or rather, if his guest should make him a greater gift, then he makes the guest, this is regarded as something in the nature of an insult, a complete betrayal of hospitality. After all, the host is not running an inn, extending hospitality like a merchant for profit. And this is the bolded section from the website, the host must not appear more stingy than the guest, who, theoretically, is the one being welcomed and sheltered. In Torvaldsland, thus, the greater the generosity is the host's prerogative. Should the Forkbeard, however, have come to Port Car, then, of course, it would have been my prerogative to make him the greater gift than he did me. This is, it seems to me, an intelligent custom, the host giving first, and knowing what he can afford to give, thereby sets the limits to the giving. The guest then makes certain that his gifts are less than those of the host, and the host in giving more wins honor as a host. The guest, in giving less, does the host honor. Accordingly, I was concerned to find a gift from the Forkbeard. It must not be too valuable, but yet, of course, I wanted it to be something that he would appreciate. So, in this rather lengthy passage, we see that Tarl, feeling compelled to give something back to the Forkbeard for his generosity, a common custom that we share with the South. This passage also touches on the concept of a stingy host, which is another cultural focus for Torvaldsland. A stingy host was often somebody looked down upon and made jest of by his peers and followers alike. At the very least, it would dissuade someone from accepting the Jarl's hospitality again in the future. The tradition of hospitality was not simply a concept of gifts of generosity, but clear and present personal attention. When Tarl comes to the hall of Forkbeard, Forkbeard himself, dressed in his finest garments, brings him water to wash, and then gives him with weapons, a shield, cloak, and helmet. The passage from the book reads, "Though the hall of Ivar Forkbeard was built only of turf and stone, and though he himself was an outlaw, he had met me at its door after I had been bidden to wait outside, in his finest garments of scarlet and gold, and carrying a bowl of water and a towel. 'Welcome to the hall of Ivar Forkbeard,' he had said. I had washed my hands and face in the bowl, held by the master of the house himself, and drained myself with the towel. Or dried myself with the towel. Wow, that was a slip. Then invited within, I had been seated across from him in the place of honor. Then from his chest within the hall, he had given me a long swirling cloak of fur of sea slain, a bronze-headed spear, a shield of painted wood reinforced with bosses of iron. The shield was red in color, the bosses enameled yellow. A helmet, conical, of iron with hanging chain, and a steel nose-piece that might be raised or lowered with its bands. And 2, a shirt and trousers of skin. And 2, a broadaxe, formed in the fashion of Torvaldsland, large, curved, single-bladed, and 4 rings of gold that might be worn upon the arm. Now, the hospitality section is a little bit short. There's not a lot of passages in the books that we can include in that section. So, any questions or comments toward that before we move on to courage?
We take a pause as Torolf Fenrisson takes questions from Sven Stark-Rost Mod. Bear with us a moment as he has a chance to type out his question. Torolf will be reading the question as it's posed and answering it.
Okay, go ahead, Sven.
This class is brought to you by Sutton's Mead, the very finest of mead. Look here, we have another question from Bane Tier. This is going to be an exciting class, everyone.
Oh, boy. And while Sven's typing out his question, Bane and Blaze, if you guys could pre-type yours, that'll help speed up things as we get to it. So, be with you momentarily. Sven asks, so I missed the first part. So since there are no ends, we invite travelers into our homes as a sign of Torby hospitality, right? The more generous we are, the better Torbys we are, especially when Southerners visit Torvaldsland. Okay. The long version, which I will go ahead and answer in voice, and then I'll put a too long didn't listen version in local, is when it comes to Southerners visiting the North, we don't really get an impression that Torvaldslanders on the whole were very accepting of Southern people. If we look back in other classes that we teach on Torvaldsland culture, Torvaldslanders have a pretty dismal view of the South and its people. So as a standard rule of thumb, we probably wouldn't be necessarily inviting with just any old person that shows up at the door. If they were friends or invited guests that we brought with us, then those we would certainly go all out for. We would greet them at the door, we would provide them some type of gift, keep them fed and clothed and protected during that time frame. And then, culturally speaking, they of course would be obligated, or at least feel obligated, to return some kind of gift, although a lesser gift, for that hospitality. Now I know, Sven, you being in Iron Hall with us and us being a port city, things are a little bit different there. We do get a lot of southern traffic coming through. And Bane himself is much more open with his hospitality than many other people are, and that's because he can afford to be. So, but as a general rule of thumb, if somebody is coming and they're not unwelcome, regardless if they're Southern or not, then yes, we would want to welcome them into our homes. We would not charge them room and board or anything like that. There's no inn or no merchant in the village who should be running that kind of establishment. That's typically something that would be expected as a guest in your home. Correct. Sven also asks, are the alcoves for guests to sleep in the Great Hall with curtains? That is the purpose of them. The description of the long halls that are in the book will typically talk about either 5x5 or 10x10 squared alcoves that the men of the Jarl would sleep in. In the case of the Great Hall, we have a ton of alcoves in Iron Hall's build design, and so we have ones for guests, where guests would come in and sleep, like Tarl did at Ivar's Hall, and then we have the more private alcoves for his sworn oathman. So, yes, that's correct. Give me 1 second, and I'll type up the quick version for those that are reading along.
While Tor is typing that up, I'd like to say from Viking culture, there was a clear divide between men of your country, men of other northern countries, and men of countries outside of what was considered Norse countries. So when you start looking at it from an order of preference, if anybody was to come visiting who was sworn to Bane, or was simply a known allied sim of yours who was well known to the Jarl and there wasn't an opportunity to invite him into the hall, you could certainly offer him hospitality in your private home. You would even go so far as to offer hospitality to an enemy that was of Torvaldsland, potentially over offering it to someone who was from the south, or someone who was from the south and was an enemy. However, keep in mind, Koreans consider those that they have fought with and have fought well often to be part of an associated caste. In the south, that's the red caste, the caste of the warriors. But we see in the beginning of Marauders also that Tarl, by his words and by his actions, proved that he was worthy of the same respect between warriors. So you are able to scale and gradiate who is more important to be offered hospitality or not. I'm now going to turn off my voice and hand this class back to Torolf.
All right, who do we have next here? Baines here, go ahead. All right, Baines here says, this would be why in S.L. Gore, since the gift is usually the hospitality of the hall, a meal, warmth, and mead, that it's considered an insult to offer money for the meal and mead. Could you give an example of how you would react if someone offered you money after feeding them in the hall and giving them mead to uphold the honor of the Jarl? That is going to be a subjective question depending on who's answering it. So I'm going to give you a general answer, and then I will give you Torolf's answer. If the gift being given is only the hospitality, the warm bed, place to sleep, something to eat and drink, then a simple thank you would typically be gift enough back, because the giving isn't very much, so the giving back should be less. If somebody were to pay the Jarl or attempt to pay the Jarl, the level of reaction that that insult might garner could vary anywhere from a flippant laugh in the person's face by the Jarl whose hall it was, to something as bad as Torolf grabbing the person by the back of his head and throwing him bodily out the door some 15 feet away. And if he happened to break something on his flight down the stairs, so be it. That can really be a loaded question. Did that answer your question, Bane, or was there any follow-up?
I'd like to add to that, a lot of people don't know this aspect of the books, and so I would personally handle it quietly, with a somewhat affronted look. This is hospitality that has been granted you. Do not treat me as if I am a merchant, without actually challenging him. Now, if you want to set that line with somebody who's from the north and has been kind of bragging and piggish, and you feel like you want to pick a fight with them, that would be a fair reason to pick a fight.
I'd say that's fair as well. All right, Blaze, go ahead. So Blaze asks, so nothing in the long haul is to be charged for, and that is why there are no coin sluts. Well, okay, that's a good question. Yeah, we would not bill anybody money for eating, drinking, or, dirtying up one of our alcoves to sleep for the night. And in the case of a coin slut, that is something that you see commonly in the books depicting Southern cultures where somebody owns a slave and uses her essentially as a streetwalker. Sends her out into the street to service anybody willing to pay her and then brings the money back. Could a Jarl own a coin slut? I guess that would depend largely on the culture of his particular lands. I wouldn't think that would be very common in Torvaldsland, as we see from the two examples of the Jarls in the book. They keep a harem of bondmaids for their own private entertainment use, serving in their hall, whatever, what have you. And then they pass those girls, freely or not, around the men of the hall that are their sworn oath men. We see good examples of this in Ivar's hall, where there are girls that don't seem to really be his favorite, that the guys just pass around and have fun with, And then he has 2 or 3 favorites at any given time, depending on where in the book you're reading, that are right next to him, glued to his side. And only in one instance does he give one of those girls to one of the other marauders as kind of a reward for exceptional service by that man. But I would say, based on that and what we see, why the Jarls have these bondmaids and what they tend to do with them in their hall, the idea of a coin slut kind of contradicts with that. So most people would agree that in Torvaldsland, the 2 concepts don't fit together very well.
I will add, personally, for Ironhall's roleplay, sending a coin slut down to work the port might be far more plausible than ever than being in your home. Your home is about hospitality.
Absolutely, good point. If there's parts of the village or city that the Jarl controls or lives in, sure, absolutely, in the port you could exploit people to that effect. I wouldn't really be surprised if Bane comes up with that idea at some point, but not in his own home. Who did we have next?
Celine is next.
Celine. Go ahead, Celine.
She has already posted her question. Celine asks, I came across a roleplay where a Torvi man offered me a place in his home with his mate. It seemed wrong to me, so I turned down the offer. But is such a thing allowed?
Okay. That's a pretty good question and a little bit of a gray area. Nowhere in the book does it mention free women in much of a capacity outside of Hilda being abducted and turned into a slave. Bera basically doing a little bit of Jarl's woman's-ish stuff around and then disappearing and ended up being enslaved herself. And then a very, very brief glimpse into the free woman from Green Cliffs. I would say that as a general rule, based on the way the culture is depicted and the idea of women who are mature adults that have their own lives, their own business or whatnot, if hospitality is extended to you by somebody, then that really doesn't strike me as something that would be offensive or wrong per se. Further, what you do in the privacy of that house past that is nobody else's business but everybody that's in there. I'm not saying that as a way of excusing people to run around and do Ungarian things behind closed doors, but as a general rule, if it's an innocent enough offer for hospitality, it probably would be okay. Now, is a man entitled to take offense to that or make assumptions, or a Jarl of the lands? That's another arguable point from another side, and I wouldn't say one way or the other what right a man has to do that or not, if he's rank-wise or politically speaking above the woman in question, if that makes sense.
I would add to that, as a woman who has to navigate the S.L. Torvaldsland experience, if you're invited to another land and the man says, on my honor, I offer you hospitality with me and my mate, my free companion, I will meet you at the docks where your men or the men of your Jarl have brought you, and I will escort you to our village, and you might stay within our home and offer our hospitality. It would be really, really crossing the line then if that man then attempted to rape you or have relations with you. Once a man says on his honor and offers hospitality, you're probably safe. So Celine, if you get that request again, you might want to respond with, on your honor, do you offer me hospitality? And then you'll know whether or not it was a sincere offer or not.
That's an excellent point. Typically, depending on the laws of a given land, especially if they're honorable, lawful people, no Jarl is going to tolerate a man who says one thing with his oath and then turns around and does another. So, excellent point. All right, and I'm going to say Yumi, because I don't want to say yummy, because yummy makes me disturbed. What's your question? All right, she asks, I noticed that in a book example above, the Jarl of the Hold offered a bowl of water and towels to the guest as part of the routine hospitality. When I repeat in the long haul, I would routinely offer a small bowl with a warm towel in it, especially to new guests as they first arrived. Is this considered proper for a bondmaid to offer this? Is it proper for a bondmaid to do it?
Absolutely.
I would say that's fine. I would say there's probably a big difference between the honor or prestige of having the Jarl himself do it versus having one of his slaves do it. But having said that, I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with it. His slaves are there to serve and to help. And if he chooses to have one of his slaves do that particular task, then that's perfectly fine.
I'd like to add that there's a great new product out on the marketplace that has a water to wash standing water bowl where you click it and it adds a temporary attachment of water. If anybody's here from a different sim or wants it in their own home, it's not very expensive. You can IM me and I'll get the name of the product on Marketplace. But it's wonderful. We have it in Iron Hall and I think it's a great addition to the role play. I have no problems with a bondmaid offering water to wash, especially if the Jarl or the Jarl's woman is not available. If, in some cases, somebody steps in and you're like, oh my God, the Ubar of Kos has just arrived, you might want to run and tug on Bane and go, the Ubar Kos is here, the Ubar Kos is here, so that he might decide if he wanted to make the gesture himself. But the way roleplay flows, it's often better to take care of it and offer water and let the Jarl then offer additional gifts. I love that aspect of offering water to wash, and I would love to see it continued all over Torvaldsland.
Yeah, it's one of those really small things, but still important, that a lot of times just gets overlooked. And sometimes it's because we're too overworked, there's too much traffic coming in and out of the hall. How do you keep up with it? You'd almost, on a busy sim, have to have somebody appointed to wash duty next to the door the entire day they were on. But, unfortunately, yeah, it does kind of falls by the wayside on some sims and gets disregarded entirely, which is unfortunate. It'd be nice to see that happen more often. Any other questions about the previous sections or the one we just went through?
This class is the Honor of Torvaldsland, being held at the Korean campus, a part of a series of classes held on Sundays at the Korean campus at 5 p.m. Toralf is hosting the voice class for this today as the primary author of this class. We'll be right back as the next portion of the class begins because it appears that there's no other questions at this time. All right, Toralf, you're up. Let's move on to the next section.
All right. Okay, well, looks like we'll move on to courage then. And this one I had a little bit of help from my dear sweet Maisie, who's sometimes better at words than I am. She came up with this beginning part, so I'm going to go ahead and give her credit for it. She said, "So who are these men? What manner of individual can so boldly and brazenly expect and uphold such unyielding standards? What gives these lumbering, semi-illiterate men of Torvaldsland the haughtiness to stand by their dogma? Perhaps the best explanation comes from the following quote from Marauders of Gore, where their upbringing indicates the molding from boys into these strong, unapologetic men." From page 36, very early in the book, it tells us, "Many of them were giants, huge men, inured to the cold, accustomed to war and to the labor of the oar, raised from boyhood on steep, isolated farms near the sea, grown strong and hard on work and meat and cereals. Such men from boyhood in harsh games had learned to run, to leap, to throw the spear, to wield the sword, to wield the axe, to stand against steel, even bloodied, unflinching. Such men, these would be the hardest of the hard, for only the largest, the swiftest, and finest might win for themselves a bench on the ship of a captain. And the man great enough to command such as they must be first and mightiest among them, for the men of Torvaldsland will obey no other. And that man had been Ivar Forkbeard." So these men, the greatest of them at least, were born and bred warriors. Between the rough environment of their homeland and the rough and tumble upbringing that they endure as children and young adults, the people of Torvaldsland were imposing and fierce. That type of reputation is well earned by their raiders, and in the next few passages we'll take a look at those examples. I saw Ivar Forkbeard standing among the huddled men near the western wall of the hall. He was easily visible, being one of the few still standing. He looked red and terrible in the reflection of the flames. The veins on his forehead looked like red cables. His eyes, almost like those of the Curry themselves, blazed. His long sword, now again in his hand, which he had recovered from the body of a cur, in which he had left it, was again bloodied, and freshly so. His left sleeve was torn away. There were claw marks on his neck. "On your feet," he cried to the men. "On your feet, do battle." But even those who stood seemed numb with terror. The bolded section reads, "Are you of Torvaldsland?" he asked. Do battle, but no man dared move. In the presence of the Curry, they seemed only cattle. This is from page 186. Now, while this passage may appear to show cowardice, it's intended to show that the heroes of legend, such as Ivar, were men of intense courage. The greatest men of Torvaldsland were the type of men who would run screaming bloody murder down the throat of the most dangerous foe they could find and joyfully lay waste to their enemies. Now, of course, that's not to say that they were reckless or foolish. There's a difference between courage and foolhardiness. To die holding off overwhelming odds so that your kinsman could get away, or to weaken the enemy enough so that your side had an advantage, that was heroic. A fool threw his life away. A hero sold his dearly. For this reason, Ivar and Tarl fought free of the burning hall and escaped, eventually finding the war arrow and then bringing the fight right back to the Curry. In the end of the passage, we'll look to the bravery of a young man who was willing to stand against a known champion to defend his sister. I warn you ahead of time, this passage is quite long. One case interested us in particular. A young man, not more than 16, was preparing to defend himself against a large burly fellow, bearded and richly helmeted. "He is a famous champion," said Ivar, whispering to me, nodding to the large burly fellow. "He is Bjarni of Thornstein Camp." Thorstein Camp, well to the south, but yet still north of Einar's Skerry, was a camp of fighting men, which controlled the countryside around it for some 50 passangs, taking tribute from the farms. Thorstein of Thorstein's Camp was their jarl. The camp was of wood, surrounded by a palisade, but on an island in an inlet called the Inlet of Thorstein Camp, formerly known as the Inlet of Parset because of the rich fishing there. The stake in the challenge was the young man's sister, a comely blonde lass of 14, with braided hair. She was dressed in the full regalia of a free woman of the north. The clothes were not rich, but they were clean and they were her best. She wore 2 brooches and black shoes. The knife had been removed from the sheath at her belt. She stood straight, but held her head down, her eyes closed, for about her neck knotted was a rope, it fastened to a stake in the ground near the dueling square. She was not otherwise secure. "Forfeit the girl," said Bjarni of Thornstein Camp, addressing the boy, "and I will not kill you." "I don't care much for the making of women of Torvaldsland bonds," said Ivar. "It seems improper," he whispered to me. "They are of Torvaldsland." "Where is the boy's father?" I asked the one who stood next to me. "He was slain in an avalanche," said the man. I gathered then that the boy was the owner of the farm. He had become, then, the head of his household. It was accordingly up to him to defend it as best he could against such a challenge. "Why do you challenge a baby?" asked Ivar Forkbeard. Bjarni looked at him, not pleasantly. "I want the girl for Thorstein Camp," he said. "I have no qualms with children." "Will she be branded there and collared?" asked Ivar. "Thorstein Camp has no need for free women." "She is of Torvaldsland," said Ivar. "She can be taught to squirm and carry meat as well as any other wench," said Bjarni. I had no doubt this was true, yet the girl was young. I doubted that a girl should be put in a collar before she was 15. Ivar looked at me. "Would you like to carry my shield?" he asked. I smiled. I went to the young man who was preparing to step in the arena of hazel wands. He was quite a brave lad. Another youngster about his own age, probably from an adjoining farm, would carry his shield for him. "What's your name, lad?" I asked the young man preparing to enter the square marked off in the hazel wands. "Hrolf," he said, "of the Inlet of Green Cliffs." This is from page 129. So in that passage, we see a boy of 15 prepared to defend his honor of his sister and his family against a massive warrior of Torvaldsland, a champion in his own right. Such were the ties of family. The outcome of the challenge would likely have led to the boy's death and almost certainly to his sister being enslaved. Yet, despite this, he was prepared to spend himself to defend her. This touches back on the idea that courage can cross over into foolishness, and the boy likely didn't stand much of a chance of winning on his own, but his honor compelled him to do what he must. Thankfully, Tarl was there, and we all know how that one turned out. All right. Any questions on the courage section before we move on? Everest, go ahead.
This class is brought to you by two great big huge Pyrenees that cannot lay down and be quiet. Come on, you monsters.
Brandon's killing me here. I've seen many times people RPing a berserker. No, I know this is a Norse thing, but it was never really used in the books under the name or that particular name. I can see them doing that, as in this passage you just quoted, the greatest men of Torvaldsland were the type of men who would run screaming bloody murder down the throat of the most dangerous foe they could find and joyfully lay waste to their enemies. Okay, so what we typically see in the book is a very, very different depiction of the concept of a Norse berserker, or a berserker in general from any culture, because they weren't unique to Vikings. And it was called, as Wynne points out, the Fury of Odin, or Frenzy. And the thing about that is that it's depicted in the books in a way that's completely outside what we see in real life. In the books, Norman wants us to go with the concept that as one man felt the influence of Odin, the frenzy come upon him, he would begin to see red and tremble and start biting his shield or any other number of borderline psychotic things. And then it would spread amongst the other men around him like some kind of strange disease. And it wasn't cultural, it wasn't in their blood. Tarl himself, who was from Earth, came down with the exact same frenzy of Odin sickness that all the other men were getting. As Wynne points out there, we've got there's a page on the site that's got some quotes about it. Now, what you're going to find in SL Torvaldsland roleplay much more often than that, I've never seen anybody roleplay the frenzy of Odin the way it's depicted in books, is they will tend to lean more toward the real-life examples that we get out of the Viking sagas and some of the other cultures like the Picts and the Scottish barbarian ages, where the berserker was a man who something was wrong upstairs. And the closest we have to an example of that in the book is Ivar's buddy Rollo. If you remember the depictions of Rollo in the book, Rollo was the biggest of all of them. Rollo made all of them look shrimpy. But Rollo, for whatever reason, if he wasn't killing people, he was basically sitting on the ground picking his nose. It didn't say if he was just slow, if he was mentally damaged in some way, but there was very clearly something wrong with him. He would stare at nothing for long periods of time. The bonds wouldn't go anywhere near him, and they knew there was something wrong. So they all avoided this guy like the plague. But when battle commenced, and Ivar started shouting at Rollo, get out there and do something, Rollo came to life like some kind of strange robot, and even he didn't take on that frothing mouth madness that you see in the Frenzy of Odin depiction. He just turned into a juggernaut that floored anything that got in front of him. So you're going to see it played out in SL Gore most of the time, nothing like it was in the books. You're going to see men who fly off the handle for slight, insignificant reasons. Basically, you're going to see the Earth depiction in multiple methods. And some of them might be accurate, and some of them might be just made up. But it's not role-played at all very accurately to the books. I'll say that.
We take a pause while Taralf attempts to see if anybody else has any kind of questions. Deverus has a continued question that Taralf is going to address right now.
And so Deverus also asked, is Kanda at all contributed to it? And based on the descriptions we get from addicts of Kanda in the book, a person who is addicted to Kanda is basically a drooling idiot and is utterly useless to anybody around him. So it's almost certainly not due to the influence of Kanda as a drug that has anything to do with And again, we see that and we know that because in the book, the Frenzy of Odin transferred from Ivar, Rollo, and a couple of his men into Tarl, who Tarl is, aside from occasionally some paga that he wishes he never drank again, he's a pretty clean living type of guy. So definitely not the influence of drugs. Now, will you find SL Gore people doing that? It happens. I've seen people smoke Kanda, which, if Kanda is anything like cocaine leaves, which is the commonly held belief, it would drop them dead. Kanda is not some substitute for weed that turns you into super Tarl, but again, that's one of those things that doesn't get rolled very accurately in the game, unfortunately. Any other questions on courage?
This part of the class, the Honor of Torvaldsland, is brought to you by Super Tarl. Super Tarl, yes, you can get him in the first 9 books of Gore, starting with the Tarnsmen of Gore and concluding with Marauders of Gore. Don't stop now. Please enjoy Super Tarl today.
Okay, we're going to move on to loyalty before Brandon kills me. All right. Loyalty in Torvaldsland was to do as one Jarl commanded, even unto death, and even beyond death. About my forehead I wore a Jarl's talman. This morning Sveen Bluetooth, before cheering men, had tied it about my head. Tarl red hair, he said. Had said he, because Norman writes funny. With this talman, besieged the Jarlship of Torvaldsland. I had been lifted on the shields of shouting men. In the distance I had seen the Torvaldsburg, and to the west gleaming Thassa. Never before, had said this being Bluetooth, had one not of the north been named Jarl among us. And that's a very important passage. There had been much shouting, much clashing of weapons. Conscious, I was indeed of a singular honor seen fit to be bestowed upon me. I had lifted my hands to them, standing on the shields, a Jarl of Torvaldsland, one who might now, in his own name, if need be, send forth the arrow of war, summoning adherents, one who might, if it pleased him, command ships of men. Again, this part is bolded on the site for emphasis. One who might now say to the rough, bold seamen of the north, as it pleased him, follow me, there is work to be done, and whom they would then follow. Gathering weapons, opening the sheds, sliding their ships on rollers out to the sea, raising the masts, spreading the striped sails to the wind, saying, our Jarl has summoned us, let us aid him, there is work to be done. So in this quote we see that it was the right of a man who was a Jarl of Torvaldsland to be able to command ships and men. It was his due and his right. The swiftest and finest might win for themselves a bench on the ship of a captain, and the man great enough to command such as they must be first and mightiest among them. For the men of Torvaldsland will obey no other, and that men had been Ivar Forkbeard. But we also see such loyalty was not granted to just any man, but instead only to men great enough to command them. Too often a chieftain's conversion would bring with it, even without force, those of his people who felt bound to him in loyalty. It was his last will, now loyally, doggedly carried out by his saddened men. Loyalty extended not only to religious conversion of the command of their Jarl, but carry on the commands to them even after his supposed death. If you don't recall that particular part of the book, that took place early on when Ivar had used his fake death funeral event to get into Kasau and sack the temple from the inside. Any questions on loyalty? This one's pretty short. There aren't a lot of instances of the word in the book, unfortunately. Though for the few instances, the ones that we do have surely state enough to get the point across. Ben, go ahead.
While Ben types up his question, I would just like to add that when we look at the Norse oath, it includes very clear examples out of sagas and the Eddas that it was expected of men who oathed to a Jarl to honor his wishes in death, to follow him as requested, and to bring honor unto him. It's always been a shame from my point of view that the by the book oath that is talked about is only to keep weapons ready. And I encourage anybody who is running a Torvaldsland sim to take some time to actually look at what the expectations of the Viking oath was, because it truly does tie into some of these quotes.
Okay, so Ben asks, and this is more of a SL or RP question, a book question. I wanted to know, since I'm a visitor at Iron Hall, and the men went to attack Port Coast, I was confused if I should come to assist. Would it be disloyal, or even would I be allowed to have come? Well, that would largely depend on a couple of things. One, your relationship with Port Coast. As a visitor at Iron Hall, there are multiple groups and subgroups within the roleplay that you can either have really easy access to, like the port group. Anybody can come and visit the port. Anybody can come and set up a store or a home in the port. And the port is kind of a lawless mishmash of people, both southern and northern, all kinds of traffic in and out of the port. And it doesn't really get a lot of law enforcement down there. So it can be kind of a Wild West type scenario down in the port. If you were to be oathed to one of the Jarls, or more specifically to Bane himself, then you would be much more obligated to be a working cog in the machine that is Iron Hall, if you will. Now, your relationship with Port Coast as a visitor to Iron Hall may have been a problem for you if you had come along and raided Port Coast. Naturally, they probably would have been pretty ticked at you for doing something like that. And to answer your question of whether or not you would have been brought along, it depends largely on who's doing the raiding. Iron Hall is a very big and active sim right now, and is currently, politically speaking, made up of a number of subgroups. There's primarily Bane's group, which of course is the ruling body of the sim, the Borg of Iron Hall, and everybody in some way is connected to or sworn to him on some level. Bane himself doesn't do a lot of outbound military actions, but when he gets the bug, so to speak, he packs up his men and he goes. Who he draws from the village to do that depends on his mood at the time and who happens to be around. He, of course, would have his own captains and lieutenants, which would help him lead that type of action. But you very well may see, blacksmiths and tradesmen from the Borg or even from the port who are, consider themselves to be loyal to Bane. They might go with. In the cases of the last few raids that have occurred on Port Coast, they have been led by me and the Sons of Fenris, which we are a mercenary company living out of Iron Hall. As a mercenary company, when we're not on campaign, the men all disperse and they go back to their homes. So, fictionally speaking, the men of the Sons come from all different walks of life. Some are southern, most are, the vast majority, are Torvaldsland people, and they live in other holds. Some of them live in Iron Hall. When we're on campaign, we all gather up together into one central headquarters, and then we function as a military force, in this case for Iron Hall, because Toralf is a sworn oathman to Bane and acts as Bane's war chieftain. So when the Sons go out to do something like that, it's usually for a very specific purpose, and very rarely does anybody other than the Sons go. That's not to say that Toralf won't draft villagers or guests to come with or give them the opportunity, but as a general rule, they don't. And there's 2 or 3 other groups on the sim, one by Quinn, one run by Blaze, and they have the ability to kind of do their own thing as long as they adhere to Bane's law. And whether or not they might have dragged you along, it would be up to them. I couldn't say. So it really depends on the circumstances. I know that's a real long answer to your question, but that's as thorough as I could be in this circumstance.
I'm just going to step in here and say that this refers back to those that won a position on the ships of men that had the ability to command them were the best of the best. And while it is not Iron Hall's intention to create elitism, it is our intention to follow the by-the-book line that says truly the best of the best are the ones that win for themselves a seat on a ship. And in this case, Toralf and the Sons of the Fenris are the primary outbound raiders for our group. That is not in any way to suggest that either Quinn or Blaze are anything less than fantastic fighters. They're just not ones that are primarily interested in doing independent outbound raiding.
It's important to point out Quinn is actually also a member of the Sons, so usually when we raid, Quinn does come along. Many of his sons and his extended family are interested in joining the clan, and that's ongoing roleplay that goes on. So Ben here followed up with, I just wanted to be sure I wasn't being disloyal to the host as I was alcoving in his hall. Didn't want to slap the hand that was giving me hospitality. I would say from a by-the-book standpoint, a general standpoint, getting away from the SL Lore side roleplay, although initially it'll touch on your question, I wouldn't normally see a Jarl expecting a guest in his hall to come risk his life with him out in the field of battle. So as a general rule, I wouldn't imagine that that would even be expected of him. And to be asked would simply just be as a courtesy on his part to not have you feel left out. So no, by not going or not offering to go, you would absolutely not be offending him. And then back toward the by-the-book angle, as Wynn talks about a little bit, it's important to look at Torvaldsland from the standpoint of the breakdown of who was above the salt, who was below the salt, who were the raiders, who were the people that stayed in the village. And what we saw in the book, especially around Ivar's encampment, was that Ivar had a group of men who lived in the hall with him, which the Vikings would have called housecarls. And these men were basically, they might have had some type of trade skill that they fell back on when they weren't at war. But these were men who lived in the hall with him. And whenever he went on a raid, they were the men in his boat. They were the men who were the strongest and most capable of all of his men who had earned seats on his ship. And so to think of it in terms of soldier versus civilian, those are the men who would be doing the raiding, the soldiers who had earned that spot. For the rest of the men, like his overseer and the men that were at the village when he came back from Cassau, these were the men who weren't really the soldiers. These were the craftsmen and the tradesmen and the farmers who stayed behind. And when Ivar went out to raid, those men stayed home. And that was as much to defend the home, should the home come under attack, as it was to just continue working. Because at the end of the day, those farms don't take care of themselves, the animals don't take care of themselves, there's always work to do, and not all of that work necessarily is military. So somebody had to stay home and deal with that. Only in times where the war arrow was sent out, where every able-bodied man got dragged out of his house and then had to go into conscription, which is basically what happened when they assaulted the Kur, would every man be called to battle. And welcome back, Bramwin.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to cleverness, and that's probably one of my favorite ones here. There's no better example of cleverness being used in Marauders of Gore than the trick by which Ivar gained access to Cassau in order to sack its temple. This incident would take a number of pages to quote in detail, but essentially Ivar took a play right out of history, the historical account of Heatstein in Luna, down to almost the exact same stunt. He, pretending to be dead, to trick the initiates into allowing his men to carry the body safely into the temple for their blessing, playing on their own ego and ambitions. He then leapt out and then slew the initiates, took a number of women into bondage, and then sacked and burned the temple. There is, however, one other good example in the book that's not nearly as long. "How were you taken?" asked the Bluetooth. "By trickery, my Jarl," said she. "In my own compartments was I taken, braceleted, and hooded." "How were you conveyed past the guards?" said Bluetooth. "From the window of my compartments, braceleted and hooded, late at night, helpless in darkness, I was hurled into the sea, more than 100 feet below. A boat was waiting. Like a fish, I was retrieved and made prisoner, forced to lie on my belly in the boat like a common maid. My captors followed. There was great cheer from the men in the hall, both those of Ivar Forkbeard and those of Zane Bluetooth. "You collared her," laughed Zane Bluetooth. "Of course," said Forkbeard. "Superb," laughed Zane Bluetooth. Bluetooth, rubbing his hands together. This is around page 175, 176. So this passage, though not complete for the sake of being concise, I didn't want to get all the fluff in between, details the daring escape, or kidnapping, and an escape of the daughter of Thorgard, and the brilliant means by which Tarl and Ivar took her without harm or incident from her very bedchamber. The success of the plan was met with much cheering, both by Svin's men and Ivar's men. And the last section is luck. I'll go ahead and move into that one before you do any questions, because these two go pretty quick. So, while perhaps a little bit harder to grasp than the other virtues listed, luck was still an integral part of one's character in Torvaldsland, considered as much an attribute as the previously discussed characteristics. A man desired luck and tried to attract it to himself. Oftentimes the only thing separating the success and failure of two great men was nothing more than luck. Was the luck good? One of the men asked with a spiral silver ring on his arm, from page 75 of Marauders. Here Ivar's followers came to him, asking him if luck was on his side in Cassau. It was nearly one of the very first things even asked of him. But surely one might ask, anybody might do that, right? Well, when we read on, we get an even more specific example. On each side of the high seat were two pillars, about 8 inches in diameter, some 8 feet high. The high seat pillars, or rightful seat pillars, they marked the seat or bench, which might be placed between them as the high seat or rightful seat. And the bolded part here is, these pillars had been carved by craftsmen in the time of Svin Bluetooth's great-grandfather and bore the luck signs of his house. This is on page 163. This passage tells us that luck was considered important at the family level, and that previous generations went so far as to carve symbols to stand for and hopefully attract luck. Luck would have been considered an important part of success in battle, to the point that luck symbols were carved into the seat pillar of the Jarlsberry Hall. Any questions on cleverness or luck?
While we wait for questions to come up, I'd like to take a moment to say that this class is being hosted by the Korean campus. We do these classes with no expectations of recompensation, but if you would like to come down to the Korean campus, they have a wonderful selection of amazing classes. Matter of fact, if you're thinking about, for any moment of time, about getting free companion, you should come down and go through that process. They have scribe certification and a wonderful addition to anything that you can look for about trying to understand. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the individual who has been copying and pasting this class locally, Vita von Delamort. She has been doing a great job. This is her second time doing this for us. So everybody give Vita a big hand, and please take a moment to send your donations to the Korean campus directly. To Rolf and I do not take donations for our class, and we hope that this has been helpful. Now we're ready to take final questions.
So if anybody has a question about the class material or just anything in general for me, go ahead and let me know. Before you ask, yes, I know my butt is sticking out of these pants. I don't need to be notified. I have tried to cover it. No, they are not assless chaps. Alright, well, in conclusion, that is true, said the Forkbeard, and then he drew himself up to a not inconsiderable full height. But who has told you that I choose to meet it? He's talking about the Weregild at this point. Suddenly, the men in the hall, both those of Forkbeard and Svin Bluetooth, began to cheer. I, too, was on my feet amongst them. None of us had suspected it. And yet it was what one should have expected of a man such as Forkbeard. Never in the North had there been such a coup of honor. Though it might mean the death of us all, those who followed the Forkbeard, and that of perhaps hundreds of men as being Bluetooth, we cheered. My heart pounded, my blood raced. I struck again and again my left shoulder with the palm of my right hand. I heard swords clashing against the side of plates, spear blades clattering on shields and ringing one against the other. Honor, dishonor, and the regaining of honor are an often spoke about topic, both in the books and without. clearly throughout the entire set of books. It's a core aspect of every culture of war, deeply embedded in the Scarlet Case of the South, and as seen in this class, in the entire culture of Torvaldsland and most of all of its men. Tarl himself goes to Torvaldsland, and in leaving realizes he has found himself again, his manhood, his honor, the core beliefs by which a man should live his life. Honor your oaths, honor your family, honor your jarl, honor your land, honor your foes who fight well and with honor. Do this and you gain honor for yourselves in return. Such is the way of the men of Torvaldsland. Such is the way of the greatest men, be they farmer or high jarl.
Thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to conclude the recording at this time. Remember, as always, this is brought to you by Sutton's Mead, the very finest of mead, Odin's Mead. If you want Odin's Mead, hurry now to Valhalla before another takes your place.
I hate you. She's been doing this to me the entire recording. Go ahead, Skylar. Oh, damn. Reminds me of Ulrich and his rants. Alright, Skylar asks, who is the High Jarl at this time? Well, you just go right for the jugular, don't you?
At this time, we'll be concluding the recording so that this portion of the class is not recorded for infamy. Thank you all, and I'll be back in a moment.